November 15, 1942. The waters south of Savo Island were cloaked in blackness, broken only by the distant shimmer of gunfire over Guadalcanal. The Imperial Japanese Navy battleship Kirishima advanced through the dark, her 14-inch guns ready, her crew confident. For years, Japan's sailors had been drilled for this moment, the decisive night engagement, where superior optics, discipline, and courage would triumph. On the bridge, Captain Sanji Iwabuchi gripped the brass rail beside the rangefinder station. Through lenses polished with obsessive precision, his gunners could see farther, aim faster, and hit harder than any navy in the world. At least that was what doctrine promised. For decades, Japanese naval strategy had built its pride on mastery of the night. Their eyes were sharper, their torpedoes deadlier, their crews more finely honed. But this night, none of it mattered. 400 yards away, unseen in the darkness, the American battleship USS Washington was watching. Not through binoculars or searchlights, not through the careful alignment of optical rangefinders. Washington's eyes were electronic, invisible pulses of radio energy sweeping across the sea, bouncing off metal hulls, returning signals that human eyes could never perceive. The Mark 8 radar on Washington's superstructure tracked Kirishima's every movement for 7 minutes before the first shot was fired. Range-bearing speed all computed automatically and fed into the Mark 1A mechanical computer below decks. It was as if the ship itself had acquired its own mind-solving ballistic equations faster than any human crew could whisper corrections. At exactly 100 hours, the main guns opened fire. 16-inch shells, each weighing nearly a ton, ripped through the night. Some accounts say 9 hits, others perhaps 20. Within minutes, Kirishima was crippled. Her steering jammed her decks, burning her crew scrambling in confusion. By 0325, she capsized and sank beneath the waves, taking over 200 men with her. Captain Iwabuchi survived. His after-action report claimed his gunners had hit the American battleship. He believed it. Under the blinding chaos of high-explosive flashes, he never realized that every one of his salvos had missed. Washington had never even come within visual range. The Americans had rewritten the rules of war. Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, commander of Task Force 64, had trusted the machines. His radar operators had delivered perfect range data. His computers had delivered firing solutions. His gunners had obeyed. When the echoes faded, Lee's flagship remained untouched, not a single shell, not a single splinter. This was more than victory. It was revelation. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had assumed that mastery of optics and night fighting gave it permanent advantage. It was an assumption rooted in experience from the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 to countless fleet maneuvers in the 1930s, where Japanese lookouts routinely outperformed their Western counterparts. Their doctrine was clear: the fleet with the best eyes wins the night. But in the darkness off Guadalcanal, those eyes went blind. American radar, primitive though it seemed by later standards, represented something revolutionary, a shift from the human sense to the electronic. It was the invisible bridge between science and battle, between theory and survival. What Kirishima's crew never understood that night was that the Americans were fighting a different kind of war, a war of data. Japan's officers had spent years refining their ability to judge distance by sight, to track muzzle flashes, to sense bearing by instinct. Their long-lance torpedoes were engineering masterpieces, their gunnery among the finest in the world. But against radar-directed fire control, these refinements meant little. The Americans could now see through darkness, smoke, even rain. In 7 minutes, the Imperial Navy's most sacred belief that skill and courage could overcome any enemy was shattered by electrons. Yet the story of how this happened was not a tale of one invention, but of 2 nations and 2 philosophies colliding. Japan had pursued perfection, polished discipline, mastery. America had pursued transformation, invention, iteration, and industrial scale. By the late 1930s, Japan's naval engineers had built some of the best optical systems on Earth. They refined rangefinders to microscopic tolerances, trained lookouts until they could identify silhouettes at 10 miles, and produce torpedoes capable of running 44,000 yards at nearly 40 knots. The Type 93 Long Lance, oxygen-powered, wakeless, and devastating, embodied their philosophy: take existing technology and perfect it until it borders on art. It worked for a time. At Savo Island, Japanese cruisers had annihilated Allied forces, in under an hour sinking 4 heavy cruisers in what remains one of the most humiliating American defeats of the Pacific War. Their gunners struck with precision. Their lookouts spotted targets long before the enemy saw them. Victory seemed to confirm what Tokyo had long believed, that superior training and engineering, not brute industry, would decide the Pacific. But the Americans were not polishing old tools. They were building new ones. In laboratories in Washington and Cambridge, physicists and engineers were doing something almost invisible to foreign observers, turning scientific curiosity into operational capability. They were constructing an ecosystem of research, manufacturing, and deployment that could move a discovery from chalkboard to combat in months. This was the American way of war: systemic, impatient, and endlessly iterative. The Imperial Navy saw its optical instruments as extensions of the human eye. The U.S. Navy was building machines that replaced the eye altogether. While Japanese technicians were perfecting the lens, American engineers were perfecting the waveform. And in that difference lay the future. When Admiral Lee's radar screens lit up that November night, they symbolized more than tactical advantage. They revealed a civilizational divide between an empire that measured strength by mastery of the known and a democracy that thrived by conquering the unknown. For Japan, technology was a tool of perfection. For America, it was a means of reinvention. That philosophical gap in visible abstract would soon become a literal distance measured in yards, then in years. As early as 1942, U.S. radar systems like the Mark VIII had pushed the American fleet nearly 2 years ahead of Japan in the critical technologies that defined modern naval combat. And as Hiroshima sank beneath the waves, that 2-year gap was already widening. The battle off Savo Island was not merely a clash of ships. It was the collision of 2 industrial civilizations moving on entirely different timelines. The Japanese believed war could still be won through mastery of human senses, through training tradition, and the perfection of inherited skills. The Americans, meanwhile, had quietly shifted the contest into a new domain, the domain of systems, machines, and organized science. Japan's naval doctrine had been born in the age of steel and sight. The officers who commanded in 1942 had spent their formative years under the long shadow of the Russo-Japanese War, when Admiral Togo Heihachiro's victory at Tsushima made Japan a world power. Their textbooks and tactical manuals still spoke of decisive battles fought by superior seamanship and precision gunnery. That heritage had produced an extraordinary Navy, one with some of the best trained crews in history. Every Japanese midshipman learned range estimation by eye. Lookouts practiced on silhouettes painted across the horizon, identifying warships by profile alone. Gunnery officers drilled until they could compute elevation and deflection from intuition. And by the eve of the Pacific War, their results were measurable. At dawn or dusk, Japanese lookouts could identify enemy ships at distances that routinely exceeded American capabilities by 30 to 40%. The Imperial Navy's technological triumph was the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a marvel of chemistry and engineering. Unlike conventional air-powered weapons, it ran on pure oxygen, burning with such efficiency that it left no telltale bubble trail. It could strike targets over 20 nautical miles away and carried a warhead powerful enough to rip the hull from a cruiser. The Americans wouldn't even realize such a weapon existed until they began studying wreckage months into the war. This, the Japanese believed, was how modern war would be won, through meticulous preparation, precision craftsmanship, and the perfect execution of human skill. But the flaw was invisible. It was philosophical. While Japan's engineers refined a single masterpiece, the Americans built factories to produce 1,000 good-enough versions that could be improved every 6 months. Where Japan perfected, America iterated. The roots of this difference ran deep into the industrial soil of both nations. Japan's naval research culture was built around small elite laboratories attached to universities and naval arsenals. Each worked in isolation, often competing for the same funding. Success depended on the reputation of individual scientists. The system rewarded precision, not speed. The United States, by contrast, treated technology like logistics. The Navy didn't just want a radar, it wanted a pipeline for endless improvement. From the beginning, radar development in America was a networked operation, not a project, but a process. At the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., physicists studying radio propagation stumbled on a discovery that changed everything ships could reflect radio waves. The concept was simple, the consequences world-changing. By 1939, a new kind of detection was being tested on U.S. vessels' invisible eyes that could see through darkness and fog. But it was Admiral Ernest J. King Blunt, analytical and famously intolerant of complacency, who turned curiosity into strategy. He saw what few others did, that radar was not just an aid to gunnery, but a revolution in perception itself. If the ocean was a chessboard, radar made every piece visible at once. King demanded that the Navy integrate this new sense into every layer of warfare detection, fire control, navigation, and air defense. His orders were impossible by pre-war standards. Radar sets were fragile, temperamental, and bulky. They required precision components that stretched America's manufacturing capabilities. But where Japan hesitated before engineering obstacles, the United States overwhelmed them with organization. In October 1940, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology founded the Radiation Laboratory, soon known simply as the RAD Lab. It was an experiment in applied genius. Within a year, more than 4,000 scientists and engineers were working day and night to turn abstract physics into working radar systems. The lab's culture was chaotic by military standards, but perfectly suited to innovation. Physicists from every major university, Harvard, Stanford, Caltech, Princeton, shared discoveries in real time. Competing teams worked on similar problems and borrowed each other's solutions freely. Success was immediately disseminated. Failure was analyzed and documented within days. Every breakthrough in one department accelerated progress in another. It was the scientific equivalent of combined arms warfare. This model of collaboration, later studied by Rand and the World Bank as an example of industrial knowledge ecosystems, shortened development cycles to months. The Mark 8 fire control radar that annihilated Hiroshima was designed, tested, and deployed in less than 18 months, a pace unthinkable in any other country at the time. The Americans treated radar not as an invention, but as an infrastructure, a living system that could evolve as fast as their engineers could think. Each model, once field-tested, generated feedback that went straight back to MIT Bell Labs and General Electric factories. Deficiencies were not buried in reports. They were fixed in the next production run. Japan, by contrast, remained trapped in its own perfectionism. Its naval engineers had already achieved scientific breakthroughs, including development of a 10-centimeter cavity magnetron, a vital component for high-resolution radar, as early as 1939. But without the vast industrial scaffolding to mass-produce, test, and refine these systems, the advances remained locked in laboratories. The result was tragic irony. Japan had the theory, but not the system to use it. By 1942, the Americans were not merely ahead in radar. They were accelerating exponentially. Every naval engagement, every combat report, and every technical log became data for iteration. MIT's Rad Lab had by then produced over 100 different radar variants, each tailored for specific tasks: aircraft tracking, surface search-fire control, anti-aircraft gunnery. For the first time in human history, war had entered the age of feedback loops, a closed system of observation, adaptation, and execution, operating faster than any adversary could respond. And that was the secret that doomed the Imperial Japanese Navy. In a world where iteration outpaced perfection, even the bravest men with the best tools could not keep up. By late 1942, what had begun as a tactical advantage for the U.S. Navy had evolved into something deeper, a structural transformation of warfare itself. For Japan, the sea had always been an arena of heroism. For the United States, it was becoming an experiment in applied mathematics. When the first prototypes of the Mark 8 radar were mounted on American battleships, even the crews didn't fully grasp what they possessed. To most sailors, the strange cathode ray displays looked like a curiosity, another piece of fragile equipment added to an already crowded bridge. But for those who understood it, radar was a revelation. It didn't just extend human vision, it replaced it. By the summer of 1942, USS New York had completed live fire tests, proving that radar could direct guns more accurately than any human gun crew. The idea that radio waves could be used to see a target beyond visual range had seemed to traditional officers absurd. But Admiral King's insistence on pushing the technology through testing and deployment gave the Americans a head start that Japan's entire industrial structure could not overcome. The innovation pipeline that emerged from MIT's Radiation Laboratory and the Naval Research Lab was more than a collection of scientists. It was a new way of waging war. Engineers, operators, and tacticians worked in one continuous feedback loop. Combat data was sent back to the lab, adjustments were made, and production shifted overnight. It was an agile system, decades ahead of its time. The Mark 8 fire control radar could detect surface targets at distances up to 25,000 yards, track their movement through smoke or darkness, and relay data to the Mark 1A mechanical computer that continuously solved ballistic equations. The computer adjusted gun elevation, bearing, and timing, automatically compensating for both ship motion and target movement. The result was machine-driven precision, a naval revolution in the age of analog computation, and this was the point Japan could never reach. Japanese radar research was brilliant in isolation, filled with world-class physicists and ambitious prototypes, but it existed in silos. Universities, naval technical institutes, and defense laboratories worked separately, competing for resources and recognition. There was no equivalent of MIT's coordinated industrial network, no national ecosystem that linked theory production and battlefield feedback. Japan's culture of perfection, admirable in craftsmanship, fatal in war, demanded flawless reliability before deployment. American culture tolerated failure so long as progress was measurable. As one MIT engineer famously put it, "A working imperfect radar today beats a perfect one next year." The Americans learned to iterate at wartime speed. The Japanese, by contrast, refined their prototypes until the opportunity had passed. This divergence was not merely technical. It reflected two opposing mentalities about power. The Japanese believed mastery came from depth, the slow, disciplined pursuit of the ideal. The Americans believed mastery came from breadth, connecting thousands of small improvements into something larger than any single invention. It was this difference that allowed American technology to scale. At MIT's Rad Lab, innovation was industrialized. Scientists developed the Mark 12 radar to improve surface tracking, the Mark 22 for close-range anti-aircraft defense, and later systems that integrated multiple radar bands to cover every possible range. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and major corporations like RCA and General Electric worked hand in glove with the lab, ensuring that every new model could be mass-produced. Each improvement was not a new program, but an iteration in a continuous process. In modern terms, America had created a distributed R&D ecosystem decades before Silicon Valley would coin the phrase. Failures were logged and studied. Successes were standardized. The result was astonishing. The time from prototype to fleet deployment was measured in months. Japan, meanwhile, was still fighting the last war. Its naval training manuals emphasized discipline and drill, not adaptation. Fleet exercises continued to simulate daylight gunnery and optical targeting. Officers debated torpedo attack formations while their counterparts in Washington were learning to read oscilloscope traces. By 1943, the American fleet was operating with a sensor architecture that turned every ship into a node in an information network. Destroyers with SG radar acted as pickets detecting targets miles away. Battleships used fire control radars to engage invisible enemies. Carriers relied on air search systems to direct interceptors with uncanny precision. For the first time in history, a navy could see beyond the horizon in real time. The Japanese still believed that darkness was their ally. In reality, darkness had become American territory. Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee understood this better than anyone. Before commanding the Washington, Lee had been a gunnery expert, even an Olympic gold medalist for marksmanship in 1920. He was a man who respected precision, but he also understood the limits of human sight. Lee had personally tested early radar systems in pre-war exercises, and when war came, he trusted the machines. That trust changed everything. At 23:17 hours on November 14th, Lee's task force detected Japanese ships approaching not through lookouts, but through radar echoes. The SG radar aboard Washington picked up multiple returns at 18,000 yards. Lee waited holding fire as his radar operators refined the readings. Every few seconds the range closed. The enemy couldn't see them. At Aero 100, Washington's guns roared. Salvos guided entirely by radar solutions arced through the blackness, each corrected automatically by feedback from the previous shot. The enemy had no warning until their ships began exploding. Kirishima's lookouts, blinded by smoke and muzzle flashes, fired into the void. They could not comprehend what was happening. Shells arriving with mechanical precision, unerring, unstoppable. The battle lasted barely 7 minutes. Washington emerged unscathed. Kirishima sank her optical superiority meaningless. In that brief engagement, one era of naval warfare died and another was born. It was the first true demonstration of information dominance, the ability to perceive, process, and act faster than the enemy could react. Rand historians would later call it the first networked kill in modern history. For Japan's naval command, the implications were devastating. Their entire tactical doctrine, built on decades of training and billions of yen, had been invalidated overnight. And the most dangerous part, they didn't yet know how far behind they truly were. In the weeks after Kirishima's destruction, the Imperial Japanese Navy struggled to comprehend what had happened. Their intelligence analysts pored over wreckage battle reports and survivor testimonies, searching for logic in what seemed like sorcery. How had an American battleship, long presumed inferior in night combat, managed to strike with such unerring accuracy without ever being seen? Inside Tokyo's Naval General Staff offices, the first reports were dismissed as exaggerations. The Americans, it was argued, must have used searchlights or had simply been lucky. Yet the pattern kept repeating. Time after time, Japanese ships reported being detected and attacked under conditions where no visual contact was possible. The evidence was overwhelming. Something new, something unseen was at work. By early 1943, Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi, an intelligence officer in the 8th Fleet, compiled the first analytical report on this phenomenon. He noted that American forces were initiating combat at ranges exceeding visual detection maneuvering, as though guided by a perfect map of the battlefield. His conclusion was bold. The Americans possessed a detection system fundamentally superior to any Japanese technology. He estimated the U.S. Navy was at least 2 years ahead in radar and fire control integration. His report was met with skepticism. Senior officers' men raised in the era of optical mastery refused to believe that a nation Japan's own propaganda had called soft mechanized and decadent could outpace them in the one domain that mattered most: combat readiness. To them, America's industrial might was crude quantity, not refined quality. They could not yet grasp that the Americans had fused quantity into quality through organization. But history was already proving Omi right. Throughout 1943, American radar technology advanced in iterations faster than Japan could even evaluate them. The Mark 8 fire control radar that had guided Washington's guns was already being upgraded. Its successor, the Mark 12, introduced improved discrimination, the ability to separate multiple contacts in cluttered environments. For anti-aircraft defense, the Mark 22 radar soon followed, giving ship gunners a tracking precision that turned night skies into kill zones. Japan's laboratories, meanwhile, were still struggling to produce even a handful of functional sets. Research was divided among competing naval arsenals and private contractors, each guarding data as proprietary. The result was duplication of effort and stagnation. Where the United States had created a centralized innovation engine, the MIT Radiation Laboratory, feeding directly into Navy logistics, Japan's model resembled feudal isolation. By mid-1943, the gap had grown from 2 years to nearly 3. The difference was not intelligence or courage, it was infrastructure. America's factories and laboratories operated like parts of a single organism. When a radar circuit failed at sea, the fault report went back to Washington within weeks. Engineers studied the failure, adjusted the design, and manufacturers implemented the correction in the next production batch, sometimes before the damaged ship even reached port for refit. Japan's repair requests, by contrast, vanished into bureaucracy. With supply chains crippled by resource shortages and Allied blockade, even replacing a vacuum tube could take months. The gulf in efficiency was now measurable. In 1943 alone, U.S. industry produced over 10,000 shipboard radar units. Japan's total production that same year barely exceeded 500, many of them prototypes incompatible across ship classes. The implications for naval combat were catastrophic. By mid-1943, American destroyers, small, fast, mass-produced vessels, carried radar suites more advanced than those on Japan's most powerful battleships. These destroyers, equipped with the SG surface search radar and linked to centralized plotting rooms, could fight effectively at night against larger ships. The very concept of night superiority, long a cornerstone of Japanese doctrine, had been reversed. The battle reports told the story with brutal clarity. In June 1943, during the Battle of Kula Gulf, American destroyers detected approaching Japanese forces at long range, launched radar-guided torpedoes, and vanished into darkness before their enemies even realized what was happening. The Japanese cruiser Jinsu was obliterated. Her crew never saw the attackers. Survivors described phantom ships firing in the dark. For the first time, Japan's sailors began to fear the night. To them, radar was not technology, it was a ghost, an unseen adversary that watched from the blackness, struck without warning, and disappeared before a response could be organized. This psychological shift, the erosion of confidence in night combat, was devastating. Omi's later wartime memos captured the despair bluntly. We have entered a war of machines. Our courage cannot compensate for what we cannot see. But courage was all the Japanese sailors had left. As the Americans' radar-directed fire control matured, Another revolution was unfolding below decks, the rise of the Mark I-A fire control computer. This mechanical brain, a labyrinth of gears cams and differential analyzers, calculated the constantly changing relationship between two moving ships. When coupled with radar input, it could correct aim in real time. Every variable wind speed, powder temperature, target speed course was integrated automatically. The gunnery officer's role shifted from calculator to supervisor. For the first time, human reaction time was removed from the equation. What this meant tactically was staggering. An American battleship could engage an enemy 20,000 yards away beyond optical range and maintain accurate fire even if the target maneuvered or disappeared into smoke. Japanese fire control dependent on visual spotting simply could not compete. The combination of radar and computation produced a form of lethality that seemed almost supernatural to those on the receiving end. Battles that once depended on nerve and intuition were now decided by data streams and servo motors. For Admiral King and his staff in Washington, it was proof of concept technological velocity could win wars faster than attrition ever could. For Japan's admirals, it was a slow-motion realization that their empire had bet on the wrong future. Omi's original 1943 estimate that America was 2 years ahead was no longer valid. By the end of the year, the technological gulf had stretched to 3 years and widening. Japan's naval command had misjudged not only America's machines, but America's mindset. The Americans had discovered something Japan's pre-war planners had never imagined: the industrialization of innovation itself. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific War had become a laboratory in which the United States tested its doctrine of industrialized innovation. Every battle produced data, every engagement refined technology. While Japanese planners still emphasized individual courage and tactical excellence, the Americans had moved to a new paradigm, a war fought by systems, not just sailors. The transformation was visible not only in radar, but in the way information flowed through the U.S. Navy's fleets. The Combat Information Center. The CIC was now the beating heart of every major American warship. Inside a dimly lit room beneath the bridge, radar screens, plotting tables, and voice circuits connected gunners, navigators, and air defense officers into a unified network. The CIC was in essence a command brain, one that could perceive the entire battle space in real time. Japanese ships had no equivalent. Their bridges were still arranged in the old pattern, admirals on open decks lookouts with binoculars, messengers running between compartments. It was the same structure that had worked at Tsushima in 1905, but it was obsolete in the age of electrons. The consequences of this asymmetry became undeniable in mid-1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19-20, 1944, was the moment when the Imperial Navy finally realized just how blind it had become. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers and more than 400 aircraft. His plan relied on the traditional Japanese strength of long-range strike. He hoped to locate the American carriers' first attack from beyond their reach and shatter their air groups before they could retaliate. It was the same kind of maneuver that had made Japan victorious at Pearl Harbor and early in the war. But this time, his opponent could see him coming. At 08:30 on June 19th, Japanese scout planes launched to locate the American task force. What Ozawa didn't know was that U.S. radar operators aboard the USS Lexington and USS Enterprise had already detected his scouts more than 100 miles away. Fighter directors aboard the carriers calmly vectored their combat air patrols into position. 15 minutes later, the first Japanese wave appeared as a cluster of blips on radar screens. 69 aircraft heading southeast. American controllers began guiding interceptors like chess pieces on a digital board. Pilots in F-6F Hellcats followed precise vector commands, altitude bearing distance. When they finally saw the enemy, they were already in the perfect attack position. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. By 10 hours, the sky over the Philippine Sea had become a slaughterhouse. Of the 69 aircraft in that first wave, only 27 made it back to their carriers. The next waves fared no better. Radar detected them forming, predicted their approach, and positioned interceptors for ambush. The Japanese pilots never stood a chance. By day's end, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft. The Americans had lost 29. It was the greatest air-to-air massacre in naval history, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Ozawa's flagship, the Taiho, received reports of disaster that seemed impossible to believe. His pilots insisted the Americans knew exactly where they were, that enemy fighters appeared from nowhere, as if guided by some invisible eye. They were right. Every stage of that battle, from early warning to fighter interception to anti-aircraft defense, had been coordinated by radar. American ships detected incoming raids long before they reached attack range. Fire control systems calculated trajectories for anti-aircraft guns automatically. Even the new proximity fuses in American shells detonated through miniature radar transmitters, exploding near Japanese planes with lethal precision. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese airmen was immense. They had trained their whole lives believing that superior skill could overcome any enemy. But how do you outfly an opponent who can see you through clouds? Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, one of Japan's most respected naval aviators, later wrote, "After the Marianas, our pilots felt we were fighting ghosts. They saw us before we saw them. They struck from invisibility. We were no longer combatants, we were targets. Radar had turned invisibility into a weapon." The Americans' technological advantage was not merely the product of one machine, but of a vast scientific industrial alliance, a national ecosystem that linked universities, private industry, and military command in constant feedback. The MIT Radiation Laboratory coordinated with over 100 private contractors. Western Electric, RCA, General Electric, and Sperry Gyroscope converted theory into hardware with astonishing speed. By 1944, American factories were producing radar sets by the tens of thousands, each one smaller, more reliable, and more precise than the last. Japan had no equivalent network. Its industrial base was fragmented, its research decentralized, and its supply chains stretched thin by blockade. Even when Japanese engineers achieved comparable breakthroughs, such as the development of their own 10-centimeter magnetron production, stalled. They lacked the specialized vacuum tubes, the precision machining, the trained workforce. The brilliance of a few scientists could not compensate for the absence of a system. The Americans, by contrast, had discovered a self-sustaining cycle of progress. Combat experience generated data. Laboratories converted that data into upgrades. Factories mass-produced them. The Navy deployed the results. And the process began again. The cycle was so efficient that American technology improved during the war, faster than Japan's had improved between wars. The proximity fuse alone, a small radar set packaged inside a 5-inch shell, epitomized this revolution. Developed by the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, it required miniaturization of vacuum tubes to survive the 20,000 G shock of firing. By 1944, U.S. factories were producing over 100,000 fuses per month. Each one was a tiny triumph of electronics, transforming anti-aircraft guns from guesswork into science. For Japan, the sky had become uninhabitable. Every new American innovation further widened the gulf. Radar-guided gunnery, automated fire control, real-time communications, all working together to erase the fog of war. Japanese commanders were forced to plan operations under assumptions that no longer applied. Night combat, once their pride, had become suicide. Long-range strikes, once their specialty, had become slaughter. As Rand would later describe it, the Pacific War had evolved into a contest between one nation's imagination and another's inertia. By late 1944, even the most loyal Japanese officers could no longer deny the truth. Technology had become strategy, and America's factories were now its generals. The night of October 25, 1944, over the waters of the Philippines, marked the point at which the Imperial Japanese Navy's past collided fatally with America's future. As part of the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura led a small strike force of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers through the narrow passage of Surigao Strait. His mission: breakthrough and attack the American landing forces at Leyte. It was a plan conceived in the image of old Japan, bold, direct, and steeped in the doctrine of the decisive battle. Nishimura's ships were disciplined, his crews experienced. They steamed into the darkness with confidence born of training. What they didn't know was that radar screens aboard dozens of American ships had been watching them for hours. At 02:36, 36 American PT boats made first contact. Radar detected Nishimura's formation long before any human lookout could spot it. As the Japanese ships advanced, radar tracks updated in real time across the U.S. fleet's plotting tables. Rear Admiral Jesse Barrett, Oldendorf, commanding the blocking force, had 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers positioned across the northern mouth of the strait, the classic crossing the T formation that allowed maximum firepower to bear on an approaching column. In the age of radar, that formation had become a trap. American destroyers, guided entirely by radar, launched torpedo attacks with precision coordination. Battleships opened fire from over 20,000 yards away, invisible to the Japanese lookouts. The sea erupted with explosions. Yamashiro Nishimura's flagship was hit repeatedly. Within minutes, she was ablaze from bow to stern. The second battleship, Fuso, was struck by torpedoes and broke apart. By dawn, Nishimura's force had ceased to exist. American casualties were minimal. Oldendorf later wrote, "We had the advantage of radar. We could track them before they could see us. It was simply a question of execution." For Japan, Surigao Strait was more than a defeat. It was an autopsy. It proved in the most literal sense that courage and seamanship could no longer compensate for technological blindness. Every tactic Japan's admirals had mastered, surprise flanking night attack, had been neutralized by electronics. Lieutenant Commander Omi, the same analyst who had warned a year earlier about America's 2-year lead, analyzed the Surigao action in disbelief. He noted that Japanese tactics, which once promised victory, had now become recipes for destruction. Against radar-guided gunnery and automated fire control, advancing in line formation was suicide. His report concluded, "Our methods are sound only against those who share our limitations. Against those who have surpassed them, they are fatal." By 1945, this was no longer metaphor, it was physics. Radar, once an experimental curiosity, now dominated every layer of naval warfare. American ships tracked enemies hundreds of miles away. Air search radars gave carrier groups minutes to prepare for air raids, while surface search sets mapped coastlines through fog. When combined with the proximity fuse radar, made every ship a fortress of mathematical precision. The result was the complete inversion of Japan's wartime advantage. At the war's start, the Japanese Navy had prided itself on qualitative superiority, better ships, better pilots, better tactics. By its end, those same metrics were meaningless. The Americans' technological integration, their ability to merge sensors, computation, and weapons into a unified network, had rendered individual excellence irrelevant. Even Japan's mightiest ships could not bridge the divide. The Yamato and Musashi were the largest battleships ever built, displacing over 64,000 tons, and armed with 18-inch guns capable of firing shells heavier than small cars. They embodied the philosophy that power lay in steel and size. But their radar installations, hastily retrofitted, poorly integrated, and plagued by interference, were relics of another age. Their fire control systems still relied primarily on optical data. Against radar-directed American salvos, those advantages counted for nothing. When Musashi went down in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944, she never even saw most of the aircraft that attacked her. American dive bombers and torpedo planes had been vectored by radar from carrier control centers that could track the battle over the horizon. Each wave attacked with machine-guided coordination. Each hit was the product of information superiority. In less than a day, the world's largest battleship had been sunk by forces that never entered visual range. The philosophical contrast between the two navies could not have been sharper. Japanese naval architecture still pursued the ideal of the flawless warship, one that could outfight any opponent in a direct duel. American design, by contrast, pursued systems integration. Ships were not built to be perfect individually. They were built to function as nodes in a network of information and firepower. That distinction defined the remainder of the war. By 1945, the United States had built 28 fleet carriers, 71 escort carriers, and 377 destroyers. Each new class arrived with standardized radar modular fire control computers and compatible communication circuits. Every ship could share information instantly with others, forming a collective awareness of the battlefield, a concept decades ahead of its time. Japan, meanwhile, was fighting with shrinking resources and obsolete frameworks. Its shipyards, damaged by bombing and crippled by material shortages, produced only a fraction of their pre-war output. Many vessels were conversions merchant hulls turned into makeshift carriers. Radar sets, when available, were often hand-assembled, inconsistent, and untested. The United States, as RAND analysts later observed, had achieved industrial coherence, a self-reinforcing loop where research, production, and doctrine evolved together. Japan's system, by contrast, fractured under its own rigidity. Its scientists were capable, but they lacked coordination. Its engineers were skilled, but lacked materials. Its officers were brave, but lacked tools. When American task forces advanced toward Japan's home islands in 1945, they did so under a dome of near-perfect situational awareness. Every aircraft, every submarine, every destroyer operated as part of an electronic nervous system that stretched from radar antenna to fleet command. Japan's ships fought like isolated warriors in the dark, disciplined, fearless, but blind. Even the kamikaze strategy, often remembered as an act of desperation, reflected this technological despair. Without radar, without modern intercept capabilities, Japan could no longer fight conventionally. The human body became the guidance system that electronics had denied them. By the war's final months, the technological chasm between the two navies was measurable in years, not months. U.S. Navy intelligence estimated that Japan was at least 5 years behind in radar communications and electronic warfare capability. But the number only told part of the story. The real gap was in philosophy. The Americans had learned that war could be systematized, that information collected, processed, and applied faster than the enemy could react was the ultimate weapon. Japan had entered the war believing that willpower and training defined victory. It ended the war proving that information defined survival. When the Yamato steamed out for her final mission in April 1945, a one-way attack on the U.S. invasion fleet at Okinawa, she represented not just Japan's last battleship, but the last battleship era. Detected hundreds of miles away by U.S. aircraft tracked by radar and overwhelmed from the sky, she never even reached firing range. Her destruction was less a battle than a technological execution. In the Pacific, the age of the gun sight had ended. The age of the screen had begun. When the guns of the Yamato fell silent beneath the waves of the East China Sea in April 1945, it was not just the end of a ship, but the funeral of an entire worldview. Japan's naval elite had spent 4 decades mastering a system of warfare built on sight, sound, and human coordination. Yet in the space of a few years, the Americans had rewritten the physics of battle itself. From Washington to Cambridge to Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military-industrial complex had become a machine of learning. Each engagement was analyzed, digitized in its own way, and fed back into the research pipeline. Failures were not punishments. They were data. The system rewarded iteration, not orthodoxy, a philosophy that would later define America's Cold War strategy. This historians at the Rand Corporation would later call technological compounding. Each improvement accelerates the next, producing exponential progress. Japan's research culture, by contrast, was linear depth before breadth, perfection before production. The two systems were not merely unequal. They were incompatible. The Americans' radar doctrine embodied that compounding. The Mark 37 gun director, introduced in 1943, represented the culmination of the new thinking, a seamless fusion of optical rangefinders, radar sensors, and mechanical computers. It automatically switched between visual and radar inputs, maintained target tracking through smoke or cloud, and updated firing solutions every fraction of a second. To an American gunnery officer, it felt like magic. To a Japanese officer trained on optical methods, it was blasphemy. Machines were not supposed to replace human judgment, yet they were doing so flawlessly. When paired with the Mark IA fire control computer, the system formed an unbroken chain: radar detection data, conversion, mechanical computation, and weapon actuation, all without manual calculation. This was the first closed-loop weapons system in history, a concept now so commonplace in modern warfare. The automated feedback cycle was born on the decks of American battleships. The Imperial Japanese Navy tried to respond. Their engineers attempted to retrofit comparable devices onto the Yamato and Nagato. But the effort was too late and too fragmented. The hardware was unreliable, and the doctrine to use it simply didn't exist. Even the best Japanese radar sets, such as the Type 22 and Type 13, had ranges and resolutions far inferior to their American counterparts. They could warn, but not aim. They could detect, but not decide. By late 1944, the difference between Japanese and American ships was like the difference between a man with a telescope and one with a computer. Inside the CIC's combat information centers of U.S. carriers, a new breed of warfare professional had emerged. The radar officer, a hybrid of mathematician, engineer, and tactician. These men and women translated radar traces into actionable orders, vectoring fighters, coordinating fleet movements, and predicting enemy courses. They were the first generation of what the Pentagon would later call information warriors. It was no coincidence that after the war, many of these same officers would form the intellectual nucleus of America's Cold War command systems, from early warning radar networks to nuclear control centers. The transformation of the U.S. Navy in 1943-45 was the seed of the information age. Japan, meanwhile, was living through the opposite transformation, the collapse of an empire built on craftsmanship into one paralyzed by technology it could not replicate. The contrast reached its most tragic expression in Japan's naval aviation. Pilots like Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who had survived the Philippine Sea, returned home to find their squadrons filled with barely trained teenagers flying obsolete planes. Fuel shortages cut training hours to almost nothing. Radar-equipped American fighters now intercepted Japanese aircraft hundreds of miles from their targets. By early 1945, Japan had effectively lost the sky. From Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, every major operation unfolded under American radar control. Fighter directors aboard carriers and destroyers used real-time displays to choreograph aerial battles like orchestral conductors. Pilots no longer searched blindly for the enemy. They were guided into firing positions by unseen hands. The entire Pacific became a controlled environment, an electromagnetic battlespace decades ahead of its time. Meanwhile, American anti-aircraft gunners, relied on the proximity fuse, the most sophisticated, mass-produced munition of the war. Each fuse was a miniature radar that detonated its shell when within lethal distance of a target. The combination of radar targeting and proximity fuses created what Japanese pilots called walls of fire invisible zones through which no aircraft could safely pass. Lieutenant Okumiya later wrote, "Our courage did not fail us, but our era had ended. No amount of bravery could pierce their invisible defenses. What Japan's warriors were witnessing was the birth of systems warfare, a concept that would later dominate the doctrines of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and modern militaries worldwide. It was no longer about who could shoot farther or faster, but who could process information faster. And by 1945, the United States had made information its weapon. This was not simply technological triumphalism. The American approach reflected a cultural shift, one that valued collaboration across academia, industry, and the military. The Office of Scientific Research and Development under Vannevar Bush had united thousands of scientists under a single national goal: to make knowledge serve strategy. This networked mobilization of intellect created radar, the proximity fuse, and eventually the atomic bomb. Japan's scientists were no less brilliant men like Shinichiro Tominaga. A future Nobel laureate worked tirelessly through the war years, but they operated in isolation, disconnected from production and doctrine. Where American engineers worked alongside naval officers, Japanese researchers labored in university basements cut off by bureaucracy. The result was predictable and heartbreaking. By the time Japan fielded its first operational fleet radar network in 1945, American systems were entering their fifth generation. Japan's equipment could detect a bomber at 50 miles. America's could guide fighters to intercept at 100. Japan's could estimate range. America's could compute firing solutions automatically. Technology had become destiny. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan later that year, they were astonished by the sophistication of individual Japanese laboratories, but also by how little of that brilliance had reached the battlefield. As Rand's post-war analysis observed, Japan had the genius of invention without the machinery of application. In Tokyo, the surviving officers of the Imperial Navy faced their reckoning. Lieutenant Commander Omi, interviewed by U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey officers in 1946, was candid. "We were defeated not at sea, but in the factory and the laboratory. Your nation fought with systems, ours fought with men." Those words would echo across post-war Japan. They would shape its reindustrialization, its embrace of automation, and its obsession with quality manufacturing. The engineers who had once built torpedoes would go on to build cameras, radios, and computers. The defeat had taught them the lesson America had mastered first, that in the modern world, information, not armor, decides survival. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the surviving officers of the Imperial Navy struggled to comprehend the full magnitude of their defeat. They had not merely lost a war of nations, they had lost a war of paradigms. What they had built with craftsmanship, their enemy had conquered with computation. For Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi and Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya, reflection became a kind of penance. Both men dedicated the rest of their lives to studying what had gone wrong. In interviews conducted for the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and later with the United States Naval Institute, their tone was remarkably consistent: admiration for American technological organization, regret at Japan's strategic blindness, and a haunting realization that courage alone could not compensate for a broken system. Omi's debriefings astonished American analysts. He was precise, unsentimental, and intellectually fearless. In one report from 1946, he summarized Japan's error in a single sentence: "We mastered the sword, but you invented the gun sight." To Omi, radar and fire control systems were not just mechanical tools. They were manifestations of a different national philosophy, a society willing to decentralize innovation, to trust the machine, and to let engineers lead strategy. Japan's hierarchy, he lamented, had been incapable of that. Okumiya, who later co-authored Midway: The Battle That Doomed Japan, with historian Mitsuo Fuchida, reached a similar conclusion. In his post-war writings, he noted that the Imperial Navy entered the Pacific War as the most tactically skilled force in the world, but its training was calibrated to a vanished environment. Every drill, every manual, every strategy assumed that human vision and discipline defined victory. Radar changed all that overnight. By 1943, Okumiya wrote our pilots fought like swordsmen in a gunfight. In his analysis, Japan's tragedy was not ignorance, but inertia. The empire's scientific institutions were filled with genius, yet starved of system. Without centralized coordination, innovations like magnetrons and cathode ray displays languished in notebooks rather than becoming weapons. The Americans, meanwhile, had turned coordination itself into a weapon. That contrast became clear in the post-war economic miracle that rebuilt Japan. The engineers and technicians who had survived the war, many trained in the Navy's research laboratories, became the backbone of the new industrial economy. Companies like Toshiba NEC and Sony grew directly out of wartime radar and electronics programs. Where once they had built devices for battle, they now built them for peace radios, televisions, and transistors. Ironically, the same systematic discipline that doomed Japan in war became the foundation of its recovery. By the 1960s, Japan had mastered the very principle that had defeated it: iterative technological improvement at scale. What MIT's radiation laboratory had pioneered in radar research, Japanese industry now applied to consumer electronics, continuous feedback, collective problem-solving, and the pursuit of functional excellence over theoretical perfection. Omi's prediction had come true in reverse. Japan's post-war miracle was the child of its wartime defeat. In the United States, meanwhile, the lessons of radar and fire control integration shaped the architecture of the modern military-industrial state. Veterans of the MIT Radiation Laboratory became architects of the Cold War's Defense Research Complex. The Mark IA fire control computer evolved into the first digital command systems. The Combat Information Center became the model for air defense networks, and eventually for early computing concepts like ARPANET. Admiral Ernest King's philosophy that technology, once integrated across every layer of command, could redefine strategy became doctrine. America would never again fight without technological overmatch. From radar grew the missile age, the jet age, the nuclear age. Each phase owed its genesis to the experiments of 1942-1945. This, more than anything, was the enduring legacy of Washington versus Hiroshima. That 7-minute duel off Savo Island was the prototype for every data-driven engagement that followed, from Korea's night interceptions to the precision strikes of the Gulf War. It proved that victory in modern conflict does not belong to the strongest fleet, but to the fastest feedback loop. The historians of RAND later wrote, "Radar did not just detect ships, it detected the future." And that future was now American territory. Japan's own post-war scholars came to similar conclusions, albeit through a lens of humility. Okumiya wrote in 1955, "We believed technology to be a tool of the warrior. The Americans believed the warrior to be a tool of technology. In that distinction lay our defeat." It was a profound observation, one that transcended the battlefield. Technology, once a servant of strategy, had become its architect. The Americans had shown that in an age of machines, doctrine must adapt at the speed of invention. Yet within that transformation lay an irony. The United States' triumph through automation and systems integration also marked the beginning of a tension that would define the modern era: the balance between human judgment and machine control. Admiral Willis Ching Lee, who had trusted his radar implicitly during the Hiroshima battle, once warned his subordinates, "The machine is only as perfect as the man who listens to it." That wisdom lingered long after the war. For even as the Americans turned their radar networks into global command systems, the specter of dependency on technology began to emerge, a theme that would echo through the Cold War's nuclear control rooms, through Vietnam's electronic battlefields, and into the modern age of drones and AI. But in 1945, no such doubts clouded the triumph. The Americans had demonstrated that science properly organized could make war almost mechanical, predictable, controllable, winnable through logistics and intelligence rather than attrition. The Japanese Navy, once the symbol of disciplined valor, had become the last romantic army of an industrial world. When the USS Missouri hosted Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945, American radar operators quietly monitored the skies above Tokyo Bay. Even in that moment of peace, the invisible eyes that had rewritten the Pacific War stood watch, and so the war ended as it had begun, not with the flash of a searchlight, but with the hum of an electronic signal, cutting through the dark. In the aftermath of surrender, Japan lay in ruins, its cities burned, its fleet, gone its once proud naval academies, now silent. Yet among the ashes, a new realization took root, that defeat, catastrophic as it was, had been instructive. The war had revealed not just military imbalance, but a civilizational gap, one measured not by courage or resources, but by systems thinking. For Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi and his peers, this truth was searing. They had lived through the moment when centuries of martial tradition met the cold precision of industrial science and lost. In debriefings with the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Omi remarked almost clinically, "Our war was decided not by the fleet that fired first, but by the nation that calculated first." He explained that Japan's fatal error had been to confuse innovation with invention. Invention, he said, was creating something new. Innovation was ensuring it worked everywhere, every time, for everyone. The Americans had mastered the latter. Their genius was not the radar itself, but the integration of radar into doctrine, manufacturing, and command. That integration was what post-war scholars would call the American method, a synthesis of open scientific collaboration, bureaucratic efficiency, and private sector mobilization. It was messy, decentralized, and full of redundancy, yet its chaos produced coherence. Japan's model, in contrast, was elegant but brittle. Authority flowed downward. Laboratories were insular. Innovations required permission to deploy. In wartime, that meant delay. By the time an idea reached the fleet, it was already obsolete. The Americans' advantage, therefore, had not been in creativity. Japan had plenty of that, but in velocity. In modern strategic terms, this was the birth of the OODA Loop Observe, Orient, Decide Act, decades before U.S. Air Force strategist John Boyd would formalize it. The American Navy of 1943 had already lived it. Radar observation, computational orientation, command decision, and immediate action repeated faster than the enemy could respond. Omi saw this before his own commanders did. His 1944 notes, later published in fragments, contained one prophetic line: "Victory belongs to the faster thinker, not the sharper shooter." That insight became foundational for post-war military science. Rand Corporation analysts in the 1950s cited America's Pacific experience as the template for network-centric warfare, the idea that speed of information flow could offset even large numerical disadvantages. In many ways, the lessons of Guadalcanal, Surigao Strait, and the Philippine Sea anticipated the logic of modern data-driven conflict. In the U.S., the men who had developed wartime radar went on to lay the foundations of Cold War command systems. The MIT Radiation Laboratory dissolved in 1945, but its alumni spread across academia and industry, forming what historians now call The Rad Lab Diaspora. Their innovations seeded the birth of digital computing, early warning radar networks, and guided missile systems. The Navy's Mark IA fire control computer evolved into digital ballistic computers, while the Combat Information Center concept matured into the backbone of integrated air defense. The principles pioneered aboard ships like USS Washington, integration feedback automation, became blueprints for the electronic command centers of the 1950s. Japan, too, absorbed these lessons, but through humiliation rather than triumph. Demilitarized by the post-war constitution, it redirected its industrial and scientific talent toward reconstruction. Where radar labs had once built fire control systems, they now produced radio transmitters and oscilloscopes. The same discipline that had perfected torpedoes now perfected transistors, and in a remarkable twist of history, Japan's recovery was guided by some of the very organizational lessons it had ignored before the war. Under American occupation, economists from MIT and the World Bank helped design Japan's reconstruction policy around distributed innovation, encouraging collaboration between industry research institutes and government. This triad, known later as Japan Inc., mirrored the same structural DNA as the wartime U.S. system that had defeated it. By the 1970s, Japanese companies like Sony Hitachi and NEC were producing electronics that rivaled and often surpassed their American counterparts. The philosophy of continuous iteration, the feedback loop, had come full circle. Omi's words proved prophetic once more. He had told American interrogators in 1946, "If Japan ever recovers, it will be through learning how you think, not what you build." He was right. The culture of relentless kaizen, the obsession with quality control, and the embrace of integrated production networks all traced back to the bitter lessons of radar and fire control. Japan learned that perfection was not a single achievement, but a process, the very process America had weaponized during the war. For the United States, meanwhile, the Pacific victory validated a new worldview, one that saw technology as the ultimate guarantor of security. The Office of Naval Research, established in 1946, institutionalized the wartime model of science-driven warfare. It funded universities, subsidized private labs, and ensured that the military would never again lag behind in technological development. From radar came computers. From computers came missiles. From missiles came spaceflight. The American Navy's leap over the Japanese in 1942 had become a leap into a new civilization, one defined by computation, communication, and control. But buried within that triumph was a subtle transformation of warfare itself. The hero was no longer the captain on the bridge, but the engineer behind the screen. Decisions that once relied on intuition now depended on algorithms, and though few realized it at the time, the shift from the human eye to the electronic sensor marked the beginning of a profound philosophical change from warfare as an art to warfare as a system. Okumiya later reflected on this in his 1957 lectures at Japan's Air Staff College. In 1941, we believed that war tested the spirit. By 1945, we saw that it tested systems. His conclusion echoed beyond the military. Economists, engineers, and sociologists would later borrow that same logic to describe post-war modernization itself, the transformation of nations into self-correcting systems capable of learning faster than they failed. The same principles that powered the USS Washington's radar now powered IBM's mainframes, Boeing's avionics, and Tokyo's assembly lines. The world that emerged from the Pacific War was no longer divided between East and West, but between those who mastered the loop and those who fell behind it. By 1945, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield of ships and sailors. It had become a battlefield of systems. What began as a technological contest between two navies had evolved into a defining lesson for modern civilization, The side that could think, build, and adapt faster would always win. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war with the finest officers and the most disciplined crews in its history. Its battleships were masterpieces of craftsmanship, its pilots legends of precision. But none of that mattered once the Americans turned combat into computation. Radar, fire control computers, and centralized command transformed chaos into order and order into dominance. The duel between Washington and Hiroshima had foreshadowed everything that followed. 7 minutes of radar-guided fire had exposed a truth larger than the Pacific War itself, that industrial systems, when properly integrated, could outperform human mastery. The men on Hiroshima had not lost their courage. They had lost their frame of reference. By the end of the war, Japan's commanders understood this fully. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omi's post-war assessments read like epitaphs for an old world. He wrote, "We built a navy for the 19th century and fought an enemy from the 21st. His estimate that the Americans were 2 years ahead in 1942 proved optimistic. By 1945, RAND analysts confirmed that the U.S. Navy's electronic warfare systems were 5 years ahead, not in invention, but in application. America's strength was in iteration, in what one MIT report called industrialized learning. The Americans had made innovation itself a weapon. Their secret was scale, not just of production, but of adaptation. Each radar model, each proximity fuse, each combat report formed part of a self-reinforcing feedback loop between research industry and the front lines. This was not evolution. It was acceleration. Japan, meanwhile, could not keep pace. Its laboratories were brilliant, but disconnected its factories overburdened its command culture too hierarchical to embrace continuous experimentation. The result was paralysis disguised as tradition. The perfectionism that had once produced world-class craftsmanship now became a strategic liability. By the time Japan deployed its first effective naval radar network in 1945, the Americans were already planning guided missiles. The gap had become a chasm. Yet in defeat, Japan absorbed the lesson more deeply than any victor could. Post-war Japan rebuilt not by returning to its old hierarchies, but by emulating America's feedback model, distributed innovation, continuous improvement, shared responsibility. The same cultural discipline that had perfected torpedo crews now powered assembly lines at Sony, Hitachi, and Toyota. The weaponized iteration of the 1940s became the foundation of post-war manufacturing philosophy Kaizen. In a sense, Japan did not lose the war, it lost first, and by losing first, it learned faster. The Americans, too, transformed. The radar laboratories of MIT evolved into the architecture of the modern defense complex, the Office of Naval Research, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and eventually, NASA. The U.S. military realized that technological superiority was not a luxury, it was a doctrine. Admiral Ernest King's wartime vision that every military function should be supported by science became policy. From that idea grew the Cold War's nuclear command networks, space-based reconnaissance, and digital computing. The logic of radar detection computation response became the logic of the modern world. And so what began as a naval arms race in the 1930s became the template for the information age. From radar to computer, from computer to network, from network to algorithm, each step carried forward the same principle. The faster you close the loop, the more you control reality. That principle reshaped not only warfare, but economics, governance, and even culture. The same process that had guided the USS Washington's gunnery now guided Wall Street's algorithms, air traffic control systems, and global supply chains. The world had entered what RAND analysts would later describe as the era of continuous feedback. For Japan, that principle became redemption. The same engineers who once designed radar detectors for battleships now built the transistor radios and early microchips that powered the next global revolution. In the 1960s and 1970s, Japan exported not battleships, but systems thinking, the culture of coordinated efficiency that American observers had once marveled at during war. Omi's words proved prophetic yet again. To survive in the next century, Japan must learn to fight with equations, not with swords. The Americans had shown the world that in modern conflict, data was as decisive as firepower. The Japanese, through defeat, showed that systems mastery could rebuild a nation. By 1950, the Pacific was no longer a graveyard of fleets, but a crucible of modernity. The U.S. Navy, now armed with digital computation, laid the foundations of what would become network-centric warfare. Japan, meanwhile, pioneered industrial robotics, lean manufacturing, and high-precision engineering. Both nations, once locked in mortal combat, became architects of the technological world that followed. And at the heart of it all lay the legacy of that single night off Savo Island, November 15, 1942, when USS Washington's radar locked onto Kirishima and rewrote the laws of war. That engagement lasted only 7 minutes, but its echo endures in every satellite uplink, every guided missile, every algorithm that sees what human eyes cannot. For the Japanese sailors who fought that night, it was the end of an era. For the Americans who fired from the darkness, it was the dawn of another. The Pacific War was not merely won by courage or industry. It was won by the realization that knowledge, organized, integrated, and accelerated, is the ultimate weapon. From that realization flowed the world we now inhabit, a world of invisible sensors. Global networks and wars fought as much with data as with steel. The Washington and the Kirishima are long gone, their wrecks lying silent beneath the sea. Yet their story remains a warning and a promise that every age of power ends the moment it stops learning, and every new one begins with the courage to change the rules.